Once upon a time, a Jewish couple had their firstborn son. And the husband and wife began to quarrel about his name. She wanted to name him after her father, and he wanted to name him after his father. And so the battle went on, and they finally had recourse to the rabbi to settle the dispute. Well, said the rabbi to the man, "What is the name of your father?" "Abijah," said the man. And to the wife, he said, "And what was your father's name?" "Abijah," said the woman. "Well, what's the problem?" said the confused rabbi. "Well, you see, Rabbi," said the woman, "my father was a scholar, and his father was a horse thief. How can I allow my son to be named after a horse thief?" Well, the rabbi, being a wise man, gave this very serious thought, for the problem was a delicate one, obviously. And he did not want one party to feel that they'd won and the other party to feel that they'd lost. So finally he said, "This is what I suggest you do. Call the boy Abijah, and then wait until he grows up and see if he becomes a scholar or a horse thief. And then you'll know after whom he was named." So today, this passage which Will's just read from Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, which is what we call the pivotal passage of Mark's Gospel. The whole Gospel moves towards this point, and after they have answered Jesus' question, the Gospel moves from that point. I've always loved the setting to this central question of the Gospel, who do people say I am? Because it takes place, it seems, in a very casual context. Jesus is walking along the road with his disciples. He's walking from Bethsaida up there on top of the Sea of Galilee. Oh, well done, Paul. And he's walking down with them to Caesarea Philippi on the coast. I suppose it's about 140 or so kilometers. And so they've got time on their hands, and you can imagine with this time, they're talking about these issues. If Jesus had done this in 2012, of course, he'd be at Tel Aviv airport waiting for his plane on his cell phone, iPhone, of course, waiting to see who was going to pick him up on the other side, and there'd be a rush and so on. But not the case in the day the story was written. They're just walking, and they had time for the really important stuff. So tell me, who do people say I am? He says as they walk along. Well, there are two things that strike me about this gospel. The first is, who is the Christ? And the second is who he asks the question of. So they have a go, if you like, at answering the question. Well, this is what people say, said the disciples. You're John the Baptist. In other words, you're like him who announced. You're like him who was a prophet, an uncomfortable person. You say things and do things that upset people. You do tough things. Some say you're Elijah. Maybe come back to life. You'll remember that Elijah was assumed into heaven. He didn't die. Maybe he's come alive because he was a great prophet. Maybe you're another prophet. And so they talk around this thing, and Jesus, I guess, listens to what they say. And then he says to the disciples, but you, what about you? Who do you say I am? I mean, you've worked with me. You've walked with me. You've seen me do the things that I've done. We do everything together. Who do you say I am? And Peter the bold, outspoken Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Messiah." Now, the Christ means the anointed one. And this is the one for whom the Jews had waited. This is the one anointed by God for the task, the one who would finally deliver the Jews from their oppression, finally unite them with God. They were waiting for a king, a Messiah, a special deliverer. And through their history, all the time from Egypt, the kings that they insisted were appointed, and God said, not a good idea, but okay, hadn't really delivered them. The priests God had given them hadn't really delivered them, or they hadn't listened. The prophets, as amazing as they were, hadn't really shown them and helped them understand the deliverance of God. The Christ is always, if you look in the scriptures, preceded with a definite article. The Christ, meaning this is the one who he is. He is the anointed one. So this is quite major for these guys that Jesus is addressing, because they see that the one who he said he was, the one whom God used to promise and prophesy, through whom he would deliver his people, is true. And so when Peter says it, it's like the penny eventually drops. But of course, only partially. It's interesting that only after the resurrection did the word the Christ pass to the name Jesus Christ, to show that I imagine the Christians had now identified the bearer of the title, the Christ, the promised one of the Jews, to this person, Jesus. That is, he had combined his person with the office, with the role, and they take him in after the resurrection. And so, if you like, it's a change from, how would you say, Mr. Christ to Jesus. I'm reading an autobiography of Elton John at the moment, and in his story, Love is the Cure, it's a 2012 book, Elton John compares his young friend Ryan White, who contracted AIDS as a young boy through blood transfusion and then died of AIDS. Elton John compares this young boy in his book with Jesus. And he says, when I was a boy, I loved going to Sunday school, and I loved the stories from the Bible. He said that though to this day I don't practice any religion, I take the compassionate teachings of Jesus to heart. He says, I'm inspired by Jesus the man because he loved unconditionally, and he forgave unconditionally, and he died for the sake of others. He inspires me. So what's the difference then between what Elton John says about Jesus, what the disciples say about Jesus, what you and I say about Jesus? If he says to us, like he does, but you, who do you say I am? It's that, I think, Elton John admired or admires the quality that Jesus has. But when he was talking about comparing his little friend to Jesus, he couldn't take Jesus for himself. What he's saying is, I believe that Jesus died for others, but maybe not for me. And the disciples also, even though they were so involved with Jesus on a daily basis, when it came to his death, the thing that would really make the difference, because this is what nobody else does for anybody else, dies for them. They mostly watched from a distance, and the scriptures tell us that they ran away. So it's only afterwards, when Jesus is risen, and they've seen it all happen, and had the personal time for this to become real each in their own way, that the Christ, the formal, if you like, becomes a name. Jesus Christ. Jesus the Messiah. Jesus the one who fulfills what we didn't know we needed. And then we begin to see. And when that happens, we call it conversion in Christian understanding, because it's what happens out there to what happens in here. It's what happens out there for everyone. He is the Anointed One. He is the Messiah. That's what Peter stated. That's what they'd come to see. But it moves from He does it for everyone to He does it for me. I was meeting this past week with a group of people, and a man in the group got irritated with someone else. And he said loudly, "Jesus Christ, man, you don't have to get so jolly uptight about it." Whenever that happens, something inside me really hurts. And it's not because I'm a prude, because I'm not. And it's not because I simply won't have people around me who blaspheme or swear. It's because, for me, it's so personal that when someone says that, it's like it sends a shock through me. It's like I feel hurt because of who Jesus is. It's like I know that if that chap who had said it knew that Jesus was not just the Anointed One, the Christ, out there, but had spent time with him, and he had become Jesus, the name which is dear. If he'd moved from Mr. Christ to Jesus, like someone moves from Mr. Obama to knowing Barack and Michelle, some people do, I obviously know them, yeah? Then he might use Jesus Christ not as a swear word, but as a dear word. And that's what happened to the disciples. It moved from the Christ out there and the truth of everything that was promised to Jesus in here. Jesus first needed them, I imagine, to see that, in fact, this is who he was. This is who he promised he was. This is the fulfillment of the Scriptures. I am who you are waiting for. And then he needed them to see, wow, this is what it's like hanging out with the Messiah. This is what it's like hanging out with the Christ. Not so comfortable always, but this is how it is. This is what the Christ, this is what Messiah, the Anointed One, did for me, my Messiah, my Lord, my friend. I guess that's what happens in all these big church debates that Christians have, because we Christians are very condemnatory of other people who put others down in other religions. But of course we don't see how we do it. And all the continual starting of new churches because these ones don't read the Bible properly, and these ones don't believe the Bible properly, and these ones are born again, but they're not born again properly, and these ones say they know Jesus, but they don't actually know Jesus, and all that. That's what Jesus is going through with the disciples. Sometimes I'm not sure how God imagined humans would really understand this concept. I mean, do you ever stop and think, oh, I do, because it's my primary work. I'm thinking all the time, have I got it across? How can I get it across? Is it real? I'm not sure God imagined that humans would really understand this concept, because it's difficult. God becomes man and walks among us, and relates to us, and lives with us, and eats with us, and goes to the bathroom. I think we struggle with it, actually. You see, it's not easy to understand if it stays in the head. It's got to make the journey from the head to the heart. And to be real, it must move from the Christ, Mr. Christ, if you like, to my Jesus. Elton John watched his young friend Ryan White die, and he knew that there was something really important for this little boy in his faith, in his relationship with Jesus. And he knew that Ryan believed in Jesus. He knew him. He trusted him. And so, as a little 14-year-old boy, he could die knowing that he would fall into the arms of his Lord. But I guess that has to be made a reality for oneself. Otherwise, it remains only a religion. And he says in his book, I don't follow any religion. But I'm not yet finished the book. It's written in 2012. Maybe Elton John does it. I'm not sure. And then what's the break point? It's that even when the disciples struggled with this thing and then got to the thing to say, you are the Christ, you are the Anointed One, then he goes and messes it all up by saying to them, well, now that you've accepted that, you must now accept that this Christ will suffer and he will die for you. And so we call that in Mark's Gospel the first prophecy of the Passion. Who do you say I am? This is who you are. That Christ will die for you. And you can imagine the struggle that happens at them in that point. We've just realized who you actually are. You are who you say you are. And now you're going. And not only that, you're telling us this gruesome thing that you're going to have to do for us. The reason we struggle with that is because we are not in control of it. He does it, and we can't do it. Mark, the writer of this gospel, puts the story of the blind man who is healed by Jesus in the few verses just before this. You know, the blind man who they bring to Jesus, he touches him and they say to him, so what do you see? He says, it's blurred. I see trees, but it's blurred. And Jesus touches him again, and he sees clearly. It's a very interesting metaphor Mark uses there, because he sees that, in fact, most of us don't easily see Jesus immediately. But it takes his touch more than once. Maybe as we grow through life and following, to see who he is and what he does. And even if we do it when we are younger, take this Jesus to ourselves. I think it takes a life journey to really get it and understand it and live it. We don't really want someone else to do it for us, I think is the issue for us human beings. We want to do it. We want to be in control. And we've been talking in the last few weeks of how difficult it is for us who have things to be dependent on one another, for a start, as community, and for us to be dependent on God. We want to do it, not God. And that someone else should suffer for me is very difficult, because then I have to receive that as a gift. And that's the movement. He wants to move from the Christ, the Anointed One, to my Jesus. You're mine. And at that point, we've received gift, and we have life. And then we grow to understand, and more, and more, and more. Amen.